Well, if you are seeing this, it means that I have finally figured out the connection between YouTube and Blackboard. Thank you so much for being patient with me. I'm sorry that I missed Unit 1, but I'm here for Unit 2, and hopefully if I've gotten this figured out, I'll be here for the rest of the class. So, Unit 2, searches. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of the exceptions to needing a search warrant. I'm not going to talk about all of them, so be sure that you read all the pages for Unit 2, and be sure that you pay attention to the tables. Those tables in that book are very helpful. I really like the book that we are using. When I first thought about teaching this class, I wanted to use a book that would be very practical. This is a book that I use every day. If there are officers that come to me and ask me questions about search warrants or tell me that they are going to be responsible for writing search warrants for their agency, it's a book that I highly recommend. It is put out by the Texas District and Counties Association, which is a statewide association for prosecutors. If you have time and you want or are thinking about a career in law enforcement, or you're already in a career in law enforcement, I would encourage you to really go and look at TDCAA's website, Texas District and County Attorneys Association's website, tdcaa.com. There's lots of useful information. They have a great search engine, so if you have a question about a topic, you can put in your search terms and it will give you all type of published articles, because TDCAA does put out a newsletter. There's also an open forum for officers and prosecutors to ask questions, and you'll have some of the best investigators and prosecutors at your fingertips to help you with questions that you might have. And if you have questions in this book as you're reading, you can always go to tdcaa.com and see if someone else has asked the same question that you have. I can almost guarantee you they have, because as I said, this is a book that I use almost every day. You'll find the book that you're using for this class in every prosecutor's office across the state, because it is put out by our agency, and it's a very useful tool in what we do every day. Another reason why I like this book is, even for you non-law enforcement folks, the concepts in this book are repeated for each unit, so you can get used to them and get more comfortable with them as we go along. But that is one of the reasons why I'm not going to go over all the exceptions, because some of them we've already covered in Unit 1. Some of them we will cover more in depth in some of the units that we have coming up. So I just kind of want to hit the highlights. When we're talking about searches at the beginning of this unit, Katz kind of gave us the modern version of what the courts are going to use, the test the courts are going to use to determine whether a person needs, whether a search is a search, and whether a person has, the law enforcement officer needs a search warrant in order to search that person's property. So two things we're going to look at is whether a person has an expectation of privacy and whether that expectation of privacy is a legitimate one. So when you're thinking about searches and whether you need a warrant or not, the Fourth Amendment basically says you need a warrant in order to search. The courts have given us certain exceptions to that requirement, but if you start off with the idea that if I'm going to search something or some piece of property or some item where a person has an expectation of privacy, I'm going to need a warrant. And if you start off on that basis, as opposed to I'm a government agent and I should be able to search any bad guy's things, you're going to be off on a much better foot. When you're thinking about exceptions, especially as a law enforcement officer, as a prosecutor, and as a student, as you learn about them, you should be able to say what the expectation is, what that expectation means, and how it applies to a certain set of facts. And also know that the court, just as we talked about in Unit 1, it's a constant balancing test. So they're looking at the rights of the individual versus the needs of the government, and trying to make a balance between those two issues. So when we're talking about exceptions, let's talk about probably the most common one that is used every day that very few people think about as an exception to the warrant requirement, and that is consent. But when you really think about it, 99 times out of 100, a search that's done with consent is a search that needed a warrant. Now, when we talk about consent, we really look at two issues. Does the person have the right to give consent for that place or that item? And was the consent given voluntarily? Now, don't get confused with all those television shows that you see where the officer basically reads the person Miranda and tells the person all their rights prior to asking for consent. While the courts will look at whether the officer told the person they had the right to refuse, that is not necessary. An officer does not have to tell a person they have a right to refuse the search in order for it to be voluntary. But again, the courts will look at that to determine whether or not the consent was voluntary or not. But those are two very different issues. Another thing you'll see a lot on television is whether the consent was in writing or not. At least in Texas, consent is not required to be given in writing. It can be oral or it can be written. That means they can call somebody in California that might own property here in Texas and say, we'd like to search your property, can we do so? And if that person says yes and that consent is voluntary and they're authorized to consent, then your consent is going to be valid. So please don't misconstrue things that you see on television for being the way things really are. Hollywood is one thing, Texas is something totally different. So when the courts look at voluntariness, what do they look at? They look at how many officers were present, whether any force was used, were any threats used, was it written, was it videotaped, did the person completely know their rights? Those are the kind of things the courts are going to look at to determine whether consent was voluntary or not. If the consent was voluntary, then obviously no search warrant is needed. Another thing you have to consider when you're talking about consent is whether the person had a right to consent. And there are, again, lots of different factors that go into that. Obviously, if you are the owner and possessor of, let's say, a house, and you give consent, then the consent is going to be a valid consent. But what about if you are leasing the house and the owner gives consent? Is that going to be valid? That's a good question. What about roommates? What if two roommates are leasing an apartment? Does one roommate have the ability to give consent for the entire apartment? Probably for the common areas, but what about specifically for the other lessor's bedroom? Probably not. So there's two things that you have to look for when you're looking for consent for it to be valid. Was it done voluntarily, and did the person that give consent have the right to give that consent? And really, when you think about it, that's a person's conduct that gives rise to that exception. I have told the officer that he can go ahead without a warrant and search my property. And a lot of times we do things that either reduces our expectation of privacy or totally waives our expectation of privacy and gives rise to other exceptions. For instance, abandonment. One of the common ways that we abandon property that we don't even think about, that I know that I do every Wednesday, and that is I roll my garbage out to the curb. Now when that garbage can is up against my house, I have not reduced my expectation of privacy in that garbage can, which is a little weird. However, when I roll it out to the curb and I think the trash man is coming to get it, it's just as easy for a police officer to roll by and open that trash can container and put the trash in his trunk to be searched later. I have essentially abandoned any expectation of privacy I have because I'm basically giving that property to the trash man. And therefore, if the trash man can pick it up, a police officer can come and pick it up. And you can abandon property in many, many different ways. If it's in your pocket and you drop it, and or if you lose something, all that is going to be considered abandoned property as long as law enforcement or the government didn't force you to abandon that property. That's a totally separate issue. But again, something that we have done or conduct of a person has done in order to create an exception. Sometimes where you leave your property will create an exception to a search warrant. For instance, if I have a rather large piece of property that is not fenced, and I take the car that I've stolen out to the back of the property and I leave it out there away from the curtilage, and you need to know what the curtilage of a property or a home is, so be sure that you know what curtilage means. If I take that stolen vehicle away from the curtilage of my home and I put it out on the back property that's not fenced, where anybody could be out there riding their four-wheelers or walking a nature trail or riding horseback, as long as it's somewhere the common person could go, it's somewhere a police officer can go. And if a police officer is back there and can read the VIN on that car and figure out that it's stolen, that is not going to be considered a search. That's going to be considered an open fields doctrine. So that's another way that a person's conduct can actually give rise to a search warrant exception. Another way we do that is where we go. There are obviously some places that we can go where our expectation of privacy is going to be reduced. Some of them, they seem very commonsensical, and some of them not so much. For instance, if we go to an airport, especially those of us that have done that post 9/11, if you go to an airport, what's going to happen? What do you know is going to happen before you can actually get to where that plane is going to take off or land? You're going to have to go through a metal detector, and you're going to have to put your items through the x-ray machine, right? Why is that? How can a government official, because TSA is the government, right? How can that government official search me and search my things without a warrant? Well, because you've chosen to go to the airport, and the government has a right to protect the safety of its citizens and interstate commerce. And therefore the courts have said that because you're choosing that behavior, you are basically reducing your own expectation of privacy in your luggage and in your person. Now, of course, there's quite a bit of controversy in how far TSA can go in their body searches, but that's going to be, again, a balancing question for the court. But just know that the conduct of going to the airport and engaging in interstate commerce, your expectation of privacy is reduced. The same thing goes when you're crossing a border. If you're crossing a border, certainly the government has an interest in what is coming across its borders, one way or the other. Are drugs being transported? What about explosives? What about folks that are not legally supposed to be here? Now again, there's going to be a balancing question between the government's right to protect the safety of its citizens and a person's individual safety. But just know that a person's conduct of approaching a border or going across the border, the courts have recognized reduces their expectation of privacy. Now, there are some areas where we really don't think about. What about school? Why would there be a reduced expectation of privacy in a school? Well, think about it. If you are under the age of 18, you have to do what? You've got to go to school, because if you don't go to school, then you're going to be truant. And either you or your parents are going to get in trouble for not sending you to school. So if it's a place where the government forces you to be, then the government does take on some responsibility for your safety. So therefore, if you at school, you're going to have a reduced expectation of privacy because it's going to be balanced with the government's responsibility to keep students and teachers safe in an area where they are basically forced to be. So a school is an area where you can have a reduced expectation of privacy. Another one that seems kind of commonsensical is jail. Again, a place where folks are forced to be, inmates, right? So the other inmates have a reduced expectation of privacy in the things that they keep in their cell that they could possibly use to harm other inmates or cause a disruption in the government's reason for having everybody there, right, to facilitate an escape or somehow injure the guards or something. So again, the courts have looked at that and said folks in jail, in a cell, have a reduced expectation of privacy. So again, by our own conduct, we can give up part of the rights that we are granted by the Fourth Amendment. Now, what else can we think about as far as expectation of privacy and where that might be reduced? What about if our own safety is jeopardized? And you'll see this argument made in community caretaking. For instance, if an officer sees someone in obvious distress and they're in a vehicle, even though the vehicle might not be moving, even though the vehicle might be on private property, that officer has the responsibility of going and making sure that that person is all right. So even though it might be a search that the officer might need a warrant for under other circumstances, if that officer can articulate that he is performing that search in order to perform a community caretaking duty, then that's probably going to be seen as all right. I know we've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. Again, these are just some of the few exceptions to the search warrant that are covered in your book, so make sure that you go and you read those pages. Again, it's been a pleasure doing this video with you. I hope that you are getting to see it. If not, then I'll try very hard again for Unit 3. I hope you have a great weekend. Don't forget your test. It's got to be completed by Sunday at midnight. There are 15 questions on the test, and I hope you do as well on this test as you did on the last test. And don't forget, National Night Out October the 6th. I hope to see you there.